2 Kings 1. After Ahab died, his son Ahaziah took over as king of Israel. But right away, trouble hit. Moab rebelled against Israel, and Ahaziah had a bad accident. He fell through the lattice of his upper room and got seriously injured. Instead of seeking God, he sent messengers to ask Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, if he was going to recover. God wasn't having that. He sent an angel to Elijah with a message. Go intercept those messengers and ask them, is there no God in Israel that you gotta go seek Baal-zebub? Because you did this, you're not getting up from that bed. You're gonna die. Elijah met the messengers, gave them the message, and they turned around without even reaching Ekron. When they got back, Ahaziah was confused. Why are y'all back so soon? They told him about the man who stopped them and gave the prophecy. Ahaziah asked, what did he look like? They said, he was a hairy man with a leather belt. Ahaziah immediately knew, that's Elijah. So he sent a captain with 50 soldiers to bring Elijah in. They found him chilling on a hill and said, man of God, the king says come down. Elijah replied, if I'm a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and burn y'all up. And boom, fire came down and wiped them out. Ahaziah sent another 50 men. Same thing happened. Fire came down and burned them up. Then Ahaziah sent a third captain, but this one was smart. He dropped to his knees and begged, please, man of God, have mercy on me and my men. We just following orders. God told Elijah, go with him. Don't be afraid. So Elijah went to Ahaziah and repeated what he already said. Because you chose Baal-zebub over God, you will not leave that bed. And just like that, Ahaziah died. Since he had no sons, his brother Jehoram became king. Morale of the story. Who you run to in times of trouble shows where your faith really is. Ahaziah had access to the true God, but chose a false one, and it cost him his life. The lesson? Stop chasing weak substitutes when you have direct access to the real power. God is the only source you need. 2 Kings 2. Elijah knew his time on earth was almost up, and Elisha, his apprentice, wasn't about to leave his side. As they traveled, Elijah kept telling him, stay here. God is sending me somewhere else. But Elisha wasn't having it. As surely as the Lord lives, I'm not leaving you. They went from Gilgal to Bethel, then to Jericho, and finally to the Jordan River. At each stop, other prophets kept pulling Elisha aside like, you know Elijah's leaving today, right? And Elisha was like, yeah, I know. Keep it to yourself. When they reached the Jordan, Elijah took off his cloak, rolled it up, and slapped the water. The river split in two, and they walked across on dry ground. Once they got to the other side, Elijah asked, what do you want before I go? Elisha said, I want a double portion of your spirit. Elijah said, that's a big ask, but if you see me when I'm taken up, then it's yours. As they were walking and talking, boom! A chariot of fire with horses of fire came down and swept Elijah up in a whirlwind. Elisha watched in awe, shouting, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Then Elijah was gone. Elisha picked up Elijah's cloak, went back to the Jordan, and did exactly what Elijah did. He slapped the water, and it parted for him too. When the prophets saw this, they said, Elijah's spirit is now on Elisha, and they bowed before him. Some of the prophets weren't convinced, though. They asked Elisha, should we send out men to look for Elijah? Maybe the Spirit of God dropped him on a mountain somewhere. Elisha told them not to waste their time, but they insisted. So after 3 days of searching, they came back empty-handed. Elisha was like, told y'all. Later, the people of Jericho came to Elisha and said, our city is nice, but the water is bad, and the land is barren. Elisha told them to bring him a new bowl with salt in it. He threw the salt into the spring and said, "God has healed this water. No more sickness or death will come from it." And from that day, the water was clean. As Elisha continued traveling, some young boys came out mocking him, saying, "Go up, Baldy! Go up, Baldy!" Elisha turned around, called down a curse in God's name, and 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of them. After that, he went on to Mount Carmel and then back to Samaria, stepping fully into his role as God's prophet. Moral of the story: when you stay faithful and hungry for God's power, He will elevate you. Elisha didn't just settle for what Elijah had. He asked for more, and God delivered. The lesson? Don't be afraid to ask for a greater anointing, but also respect God's messengers, because playing with them can have serious consequences. 2 Kings 3. After Ahaziah died, his brother Jehoram became king of Israel. He was bad, but not as bad as Ahab and Jezebel. He still did evil, though, because he refused to turn away from Jeroboam's sins. Meanwhile, King Mesha of Moab had been paying tribute to Israel, giving them 100,000 lambs and the wool from 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, Mesha saw an opportunity and rebelled against Israel. So King Jehoram called up King Jehoshaphat of Judah and said, "Yo, Moab just turned against us. You riding with me?" Jehoshaphat said, "I got you." "My troops are your troops. My horses are your horses. How we rolling?" Jehoram said, "We'll go through the wilderness of Edom." Along the way, they picked up the king of Edom, so now it was a 3-king alliance. But after 7 days of marching, they had a problem: no water for the army or their animals. Jehoram panicked. "God brought us together just to let Moab destroy us." But Jehoshaphat said, "Hold up, isn't there a prophet around here we can ask God through?" One of Jehoram's officers said, "Yeah, Elisha's here, the one who used to roll with Elijah." Jehoshaphat said, "That's the man we need." So the 3 kings went to Elisha, but when they got there, Elisha looked at Jehoram and said, "What do you want from me?" "Why don't you go ask your mom and dad's prophets? Basically, go ask Baal, since that's who y'all been serving." Jehoram begged, "Nah, please help us. God brought us here, and now we're about to be handed over to Moab." Elisha said, "If it wasn't for Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't even acknowledge you. But since he's here, I'll help. Bring me a musician." As the musician played, God's Spirit came over Elisha, and he said, "This is what the Lord says. Dig ditches all over this valley. You won't see rain or wind, but water will come, and you'll have enough to drink. And by the way, God is also handing Moab over to you. Take their cities, cut down their trees, stop up their wells, and ruin their land." The next morning, at the time of the grain offering, water suddenly flowed in from Edom and filled the valley. Meanwhile, the Moabites woke up and saw the water, but because of the way the sun hit it, it looked red like blood. They thought, "The 3 kings must have turned on each other. Let's go collect the spoils." But when they got to Israel's camp, they were ambushed. Israel attacked, drove them back, took their cities, and destroyed their land. Just as God said. King Mesha, realizing he was losing, tried to fight back but failed. In desperation, he did something wild. He sacrificed his own son, the heir to his throne, as a burnt offering on the wall. This act caused such shock and horror that Israel backed off and went home. Moral of the story: when you're moving with God, He'll provide what you need, even in the middle of a desert. Israel, Judah, and Edom thought they were doomed, but God gave them water without a single drop of rain. The lesson? Faith moves before the blessing comes. Sometimes you gotta dig ditches and trust that God will fill them. 2 Kings 4. Elisha helps a widow. A widow of one of the prophets came to Elisha, crying, "My husband is dead, and now his creditor is coming to take my sons as slaves." Elisha asked, "What do you have in your house?" She said, "Nothing, except a little jar of oil." Elisha told her, "Go borrow as many empty jars as you can from your neighbors. Then go inside, shut the door, and start pouring oil into them." She obeyed, and as she poured, the oil kept flowing. Every jar she had was filled. When she told Elisha, he said, "Now go sell the oil, pay your debts, and live off the rest." The Shunammite woman's blessing. There was a wealthy woman in Shunem who always invited Elisha to eat when he passed by. She even told her husband, "Let's build a small room on the roof for him, with a bed, table, chair, and lamp so he can stay whenever he comes." Elisha was grateful and asked his servant Gehazi, "What can we do for her?" Gehazi said, "She has no son and her husband is old." Elisha called her and said, "By this time next year you will have a son." She was like, "Don't play with me, man of God." But just as he said she had a son, the boy dies and comes back to life. Years later, the boy was out in the field with his father when he suddenly grabbed his head and said, "My head! My head." The father had him carried home, but by noon, the boy died in his mother's arms. She didn't panic. She laid him on Elisha's bed, shut the door, and rode straight to Elisha. When she found him, she grabbed his feet and said, "Didn't I tell you not to get my hopes up?" Elisha sent Gehazi ahead with his staff to lay on the boy, but nothing happened. When Elisha arrived, he prayed, stretched himself over the boy, and breathed into him. Suddenly, the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. The woman fell at Elisha's feet in gratitude, then took her son and left. Poisoned stew made edible. Later there was a famine and Elisha's prophets were making stew. One of them accidentally put in wild gourds that were poisonous. When they tasted it, they cried, "Man of God, there's death in the pot." Elisha threw some flour in, and the stew became safe to eat, feeding 100 men with a small meal. A man brought Elisha 20 loaves of bread and some grain, but Elisha said, "Give it to the people so they can eat." The servant was like, "This isn't enough for 100 men. But Elisha said, "God says they will eat and have leftovers." And just like that, everyone ate, and there was food left over. Moral of the story. God is a provider, whether it's paying debts, giving life, fixing mistakes, or multiplying resources. He always comes through. The lesson: bring what little you have to God and watch him turn it into more than enough. 2 Kings 5. Naaman was that dude, big-time commander, respected, winning battles left and right. But he had one major problem: leprosy. Now, in one of his raids, his people took a young Israelite girl as a servant for his wife. This girl saw Naaman struggling and was like, "If only my master could go see the prophet in Samaria, he'd get healed for real." Naaman heard this and went straight to the king of Aram, like, "Yo, I got a plug in Israel that might be able to heal me." The king was like, "Say less," and wrote a letter to the king of Israel, sending Naaman with silver, gold, and fresh outfits. When Naaman showed up with the letter, the king of Israel freaked out like, "Am I God? How I'm supposed to heal this man?" He thought it was a setup. Elisha, the prophet, heard about it and was like, "Send him to me. He'll learn today that there's a real prophet in Israel." So Naaman pulled up to Elisha's house with his whole squad, expecting some big dramatic healing ceremony. But Elisha didn't even come outside. He just sent a message. "Go dip yourself in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be straight." Naaman got heated. "That's it? No prayer? No waving hands over me? The Jordan? That dirty river? We got better rivers back home. He was about to leave mad, but his servants were like, "Boss, if he told you to do something hard, you would have done it, right? So why not at least try this?" Naaman humbled himself, went down to the Jordan, and dipped 7 times. When he came up that last time, his skin was fresh like a newborn baby, completely healed. Overwhelmed, he went back to Elisha, saying, "Now I know. Your God is the real one. Let me bless you with these gifts." But Elisha wasn't about that. "I don't need it. This was God, not me." Naaman was like, "Bet, but can I at least take some dirt back home? I ain't worshiping no other gods but yours from now on." Elisha let him go in peace. Now, Elisha's servant Gehazi got greedy. He thought, "My master let this man slide with all that money? Nah, I'm finna get some of that." So he ran after Naaman, made up a story about needing silver and clothes for some profits, and Naaman, still grateful, gave it to him without question. When Gehazi got back, Elisha already knew what was up. "Where you been?" Gehazi tried to play it cool, but Elisha wasn't fooled. "You really thought you could finesse God? Now the same disease that was on Naaman is on you and your family forever." And just like that, Gehazi walked away covered in leprosy. Moral of the story: obedience brings blessings, but pride and greed will have you losing everything. Stay humble, trust God's process, and don't try to play him. He sees it all. 2 Kings 6. The prophets were growing in number, and they told Elisha, "Yo, this place is getting too small for us. Let's build a bigger spot by the Jordan." Elisha was cool with it, so they went to chop down trees. But while one of them was cutting, his axe head flew off into the river. He panicked, like, "Master, that was borrowed." Elisha stayed calm. "Where did it fall?" The man pointed, and Elisha threw a stick in the water. Suddenly, the iron axe head floated to the top. "Go ahead, grab it," Elisha said, and just like that, problem solved. Meanwhile, the king of Aram was plotting against Israel, but every time he set up an ambush, Israel avoided it. He got heated and thought there was a snitch in his camp. His officers told him, "It ain't us. It's Elisha, the prophet. He even knows what you say in your bedroom." The king wasn't having that. "Find out where he is," he ordered. When they found Elisha in Dothan, the king sent a whole army with horses and chariots to capture him. Early the next morning, Elisha's servant woke up, saw the army surrounding them, and panicked. "Master, what we gonna do?" Elisha was unbothered. "Don't trip. There's more with us than with them." Then he prayed, "Lord, open his eyes." Instantly, the servant saw the hills full of fiery chariots. God's army was already in position. When the Arameans moved in, Elisha prayed again. "Strike them with blindness." Boom. They all went blind. Then Elisha finessed them, saying, "Y'all in the wrong place. Follow me. I'll take you to the man you're looking for." He led them straight into the hands of Israel's king. The king was hyped, like, should we take them out? Elisha said, "Nah, feed them and send them home." So they threw a feast for their enemies, then sent them back. After that, Aram stopped messing with Israel for a while. Later, King Ben-Hadad of Aram came back and put Samaria under siege. Things got so bad that people were paying crazy prices for donkey heads and even eating their own kids. The king of Israel was furious and blamed God, vowing to take Elisha out. Elisha, chilling at home, already knew what was coming. He told his people, "The king's hitman is on the way, but don't let him in." When the king himself showed up, frustrated with God, Elisha hit him with a prophecy. By this time tomorrow, food prices will drop drastically. One of the king's officers laughed, like, "Even if God opened the heavens, that couldn't happen." Elisha responded, Oh, you'll see it happen, but you won't eat any of it. Moral of the story: when God is for you, no enemy can stand against you. Fear is a lack of vision. Sometimes you just need God to open your eyes. And don't doubt his promises, because the same people who laugh at them might miss out on the blessing. 2 Kings 7, Elisha told everybody, "Listen up. By this time tomorrow, food prices are going to drop big time. Flour and barley will be cheap again." One of the king's officers scoffed. "Even if God opened the heavens, that's impossible." Elisha hit him with, "Oh, you'll see it happen, but you won't get to eat any of it." Meanwhile, outside the city, 4 lepers were sitting at the gates, starving. One of them was like, "Bruh, why are we just sitting here waiting to die? If we go in the city, we starve. If we stay here, we starve. Let's roll up to the Aramean camp. Worst case, they kill us, but either way, we were gonna die anyway." So they got up at dusk and walked to the Aramean camp. But when they got there, nobody was around. God had made the Arameans hear the sound of a mighty army, chariots, horses, and soldiers. So they panicked and ran, thinking Israel had teamed up with other nations to attack them. They left everything: tents, food, silver, gold, just dipped. The lepers couldn't believe it. They ate, drank, and started stashing silver and gold. But then one of them was like, "Yo, we wrong for this. The city is starving, and we're over here feasting. If we wait till morning, something bad might happen. Let's go tell the king." They went back to the city and told the gatekeepers, who passed the message up to the king. The king thought it was a trap, like the Arameans were hiding, waiting for Israel to come out so they could ambush them. But one of his officers suggested, "Let's send a few men on the last remaining horses and check it out." They went and saw that the road was littered with abandoned clothes and supplies from the fleeing army. When they reported back, the people stormed out of the city and raided the Aramean camp. Just like Elisha said, food prices dropped immediately. Now remember that officer who doubted Elisha? The king put him in charge of the city gate, but when the starving crowd rushed out, they trampled him to death. He saw the miracle, but he never got to eat any of it, just like Elisha had prophesied. Moral of the story: never doubt what God can do, no matter how impossible it looks. He can flip your situation overnight, but don't be like the doubting officer. Faith is the key to receiving the blessing. 2 Kings 8. Elisha told the woman whose son he had brought back to life, "Listen, a famine is coming and it's going to last 7 years. You need to leave and find somewhere safe." She trusted him, packed up, and moved to Philistine territory. 7 years later, she came back to Israel and went straight to the king, hoping to get her house and land back. Now, at that exact moment, the king was talking to Gehazi, Elisha's former servant, about all the miracles Elisha had done. Right when Gehazi was telling the story of how Elisha brought this woman's son back to life, she walked in. Gehazi was like, "Yo, that's her, and that's her son, the one Elisha resurrected." The king was amazed and immediately gave her back everything she lost, plus all the income her land had produced while she was gone. Meanwhile, Elisha traveled to Damascus, where King Ben-Hadad of Aram was sick. The king heard Elisha was in town and sent his servant Hazael with gifts to ask, "Will I recover from this sickness?" Elisha told Hazael, "Tell him he'll recover, but truthfully he's not going to make it." Then Elisha stared at Hazael so intensely that Hazael got uncomfortable. Elisha started crying. Hazael was like, "Why you crying, my lord?" Elisha replied, "Because I see what you're going to do. You're going to bring destruction to Israel, burn cities, kill young men, even hurt women and children." Hazael was shocked. "What? Me? I'm just a servant. How could I do all that?" Elisha answered, God already showed me. You're about to be king." Hazael went back to Ben-Hadad and told him, "Good news. You'll recover." But the next day, Hazael smothered him with a wet cloth and took the throne. Back in Judah, Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, became king. Unlike his father, he was a terrible leader, walking in the evil ways of Ahab's family, especially since he was married to Ahab's daughter. He led the people away from God, and because of that, things started falling apart. Edom and Libnah revolted, and he barely escaped with his life. Even with all this mess, God didn't destroy Judah completely. He kept his promise to David, ensuring his descendants would always have a throne. After Jehoram died, his son Ahaziah became king. He was just as bad, following the wicked ways of Ahab's family. He even linked up with King Joram of Israel to fight against Hazael, but Joram got wounded. When Ahaziah went to visit Joram in Jezreel, it set the stage for God's judgment to come down hard on Ahab's family. Moral of the story: God's plans always come to pass, whether people see it coming or not. Those who follow him are protected and restored, but those who turn away set themselves up for downfall. Be careful who you align yourself with. Some connections will bring blessings, while others will bring destruction. 2 Kings 9. Elisha called one of his young prophets and said, "Grab this oil, run to Ramoth Gilead, find Jehu, anoint him as king, and then get out of there quick." The young prophet found Jehu, took him into a private room, poured the oil on his head, and said, "The Lord has anointed you as king over Israel. Your mission? Wipe out Ahab's whole family, every last one, Jezebel too. No one who follows them will be left standing." Then, just like Elisha said, the prophet dipped out. Jehu stepped out and his fellow officers were like, "Yo, what was that about?" Jehu played it off. "Y'all know how prophets are." But they pressed him, so he told them, and immediately they laid their cloaks down, blew trumpets, and shouted, "Jehu is king." Jehu wasted no time. He jumped in his chariot and rode straight for Jezreel, where King Joram of Israel was recovering from his wounds. Ahaziah, king of Judah, was visiting him. As Jehu approached, a watchman on the tower saw him coming and warned Joram. The king sent out a rider to ask, "Do you come in peace?" Jehu shot back, "What you know about peace?" "Tell your king I'm here." The rider didn't return, so Joram sent another one. Same result. Then the watchman noticed, "The chariot driver rides like Jehu. He drives like a madman." Joram and Ahaziah got in their chariots and rode out to meet Jehu. When they faced off, Joram asked, "Do you come in peace, Jehu?" Jehu snapped, "How can there be peace when your mama Jezebel is out here with all her witchcraft and corruption?" Joram panicked, turned to Ahaziah, and yelled, "It's a trap!" But before he could escape, Jehu pulled his bow and shot him right in the heart. His body slumped over in the chariot. Then Jehu chased down Ahaziah. He got hit too and barely made it to Megiddo before dying. Now it was Jezebel's turn. She was in her palace, heard Jehu was coming, and tried to play it cool. She put on makeup, did her hair, and looked out the window. When Jehu arrived, she called out, "So you come in here like some rebel, Jehu?" Jehu looked up and shouted, "Who's on my side?" A few of her servants looked down at him. He said, "Throw her down." And just like that, they tossed Jezebel out the window. She hit the ground hard and her blood splattered on the walls and horses. Jehu ran her over with his chariot for good measure. Later, he told his men, "Go bury her. She was a queen." But when they went to get her body, all that was left was her skull, feet, and hands. The dogs had eaten the rest, just like God said would happen. Moral of the story: when God says it's time for judgment, It's coming, no matter how much power or influence someone has. Evil can only run wild for so long before God shuts it down. And if you're living recklessly, remember, the way you live determines the way you go out. 2 Kings 10. Jehu wasn't done yet. He had a whole mission: wipe out Ahab's family and shut down Baal worship in Israel. First, he sent letters to the rulers and elders in Samaria, where Ahab's 70 sons were living. The letter said, "Y'all got the king's sons, chariots, horses, and weapons. Pick the best one, put him on the throne, and let's go to war." They panicked. "Nah, if 2 kings couldn't stop Jehu, what can we do?" So they sent Jehu a message. "We surrender. We'll do whatever you say." Jehu replied, "All right then, if y'all really on my side, bring me the heads of Ahab's 70 sons by tomorrow." By the next day, they sent 70 heads in baskets to Jehu in Jezreel. He laid them at the city gate and told the people, "Look, I only took out Joram, but these were Ahab's people. This is proof that the Lord's word is coming true." Then he executed everyone connected to Ahab's family in Jezreel. Next, Jehu rode up to Samaria. On the way, he ran into some relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah. He asked, "Who are y'all?" They said, "We're Ahaziah's family. We're here to visit the king and queen." Bad move. Jehu ordered his men to take them out. 42 people gone. Then Jehu met Jehonadab, a man of God. Jehu asked, "Are you with me like I'm with you?" Jehonadab said, "I'm with you." Jehu helped him into his chariot and said, "Come ride with me and see how serious I am about doing the Lord's work." When Jehu got to Samaria, he finished off the rest of Ahab's family, but he still had one more thing to handle: Baal worship. He played it smart. He announced, "Ahab served Baal a little, but me? I'm about to go all out for Baal. Gather all the priests, prophets, and worshippers of Baal. Nobody better be missing or else." Everybody showed up at the temple of Baal, thinking Jehu was about to throw the biggest worship service ever. He made sure they wore their special robes. Then he had his men surround the place. Once everyone was inside, Jehu gave the order, "Take them all out." No survivors. His men went in and handled business. Then they tore down the temple, smashed the idols, and turned the place into a public toilet. That was the end of Baal worship in Israel. Even though Jehu followed God's orders to wipe out Ahab's family and Baal's false religion, he didn't fully commit to God himself. He still allowed idol worship in Israel. Because of what he did to Ahab's family, God told him, "Your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel for 4 generations." But since he didn't fully obey God, Israel started losing territory to their enemies. After ruling for 28 years, Jehu died, and his son Jehoahaz became king. Moral of the story: partial obedience is still disobedience. Jehu handled God's business when it suited him, but he never gave his whole heart to God. If you really want to see God's favor and protection, you have to go all in, not halfway. 2 Kings 11, when Ahaziah, king of Judah, was killed, his mother Athaliah saw an opportunity. Instead of mourning, she went full villain mode and wiped out the entire royal family so she could take the throne for herself. But one baby survived. Joash, his aunt Jehosheba, Ahaziah's sister, snatched him up and hid him in the temple with his nurse. For 6 years, while Athaliah ruled, Joash stayed hidden under the protection of Jehoiada the priest. In the 7th year, Jehoiada knew it was time to make a move. He gathered the commanders, bodyguards, and temple guards and laid out the plan. Here's the deal. One group guards the palace, one group guards the city gate, and the rest of y'all protect the temple. We're crowning the real king today. They brought out Joash, put a crown on his head, anointed him, and started shouting, "Long live the king!" Athaliah heard the noise and rushed to the temple. When she saw Joash standing there with the crown, she screamed, "Treason! Treason!" Jehoiada commanded the guards, "Take her out, but don't kill her in the temple." They dragged her outside and executed her at the horse gate. With Athaliah gone, Jehoiada made a covenant between God, the king, and the people, renewing their commitment to serve the Lord. Then the people stormed the temple of Baal, tore it down, smashed the idols, and killed the high priest of Baal right in front of the altars. Joash was only 7 years old when he became king, and under Jehoiada's guidance, Judah finally started getting back on track. Moral of the story: no evil ruler can stop God's plan. Even when it looks like darkness is winning, God always preserves a remnant to carry out his purpose. Stay faithful, and in due time, he will restore order and justice. 2 Kings 12. Joash became king at just 7 years old, and as long as Jehoiada the priest was guiding him, he did what was right in God's eyes. But despite all the progress, the high places, illegal worship sites, were still up, and people kept making sacrifices there instead of at the temple. After some years, Joash noticed that the temple was falling apart, so he told the priests, "Take the offerings that come in and use them to repair the temple." But years went by, and nothing got fixed. Joash called out the priests, "Why hasn't the temple been repaired? From now on, don't collect money for yourselves. Use it strictly for the temple." So Jehoiada set up a chest by the altar where people could drop their offerings. Whenever it filled up, the king's secretary and the high priest would count the money and give it to the workers, carpenters, masons, and builders to repair the Lord's house. Since the money was going directly to them, everything got fixed without corruption. However, Joash made a critical mistake. When King Hazael of Aram attacked and was about to invade Jerusalem, Joash panicked. Instead of trusting God, he emptied out the temple's treasures, gold and valuable items that past kings had dedicated to God, and gave them to Hazael as a bribe. The plan worked, and Hazael backed off, but Joash's lack of faith showed he was slipping. Later, after Jehoiada died, Joash fell off even more. He let bad influences pull him away from God. When Jehoiada's son, Zechariah, confronted him about it, Joash ordered him to be killed right in the temple, the same temple that Jehoiada had protected for years. His betrayal didn't go unnoticed. His own officials turned against him and assassinated him in his bed. Joash was buried in Jerusalem, but not in the royal tombs, because the people knew he had turned his back on God. His son Amaziah took the throne after him. Moral of the story: starting strong means nothing if you don't finish strong. Joash did well while he had godly guidance, but once he abandoned wisdom, he fell apart. Stay rooted in God, or you'll end up making desperate choices that lead to downfall. 2 Kings 13. After Jehu died, his son Jehoahaz became king of Israel, but he kept doing evil, following the same sins as Jeroboam, who had led Israel into idol worship. Because of this, God allowed King Hazael of Aram to oppress Israel nonstop. Jehoahaz finally woke up and cried out to God for help, and God, being merciful, sent a deliverer to rescue Israel. But even after that, Israel still didn't fully turn back to God. The idol worship continued, and the nation remained weak with only a small army left, just 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers. After Jehoahaz died, his son Jehoash, or Joash, became king. He also did evil in God's sight, walking in Jeroboam's sins just like his father did. Elisha's final prophecy. At this time, Elisha was old and sick, about to die. King Jehoash visited him weeping. my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." Basically, "We need you, Elisha." Elisha told him, "Grab a bow and some arrows." Jehoash obeyed. Elisha said, "Open the east window and shoot." Jehoash shot an arrow. Elisha declared, "That arrow represents God's victory over Aram. You will defeat them at Aphek." Then Elisha said, "Now take the arrows and strike the ground." Jehoash struck the ground 3 times and stopped. Elisha got mad. "Why did you stop at 3? If you had struck 5 or 6 times, you would have completely destroyed Aram. But now you'll only defeat them 3 times. Shortly after, Elisha died and they buried him, a posthumous miracle. Some time later, raiders from Moab invaded the land. While some Israelites were burying a man, they saw the raiders coming, so they quickly threw the dead man into Elisha's tomb. As soon as the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came back to life and stood up. Meanwhile, King Hazael of Aram kept oppressing Israel, just like before. But because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God didn't let Israel be completely destroyed. When Hazael died, his son Ben-Hadad took over. Jehoash took advantage of this and went to war, just like Elisha had prophesied. He defeated Aram 3 times, reclaiming Israel's lost cities. But because he hadn't struck the ground more times, Aram wasn't fully destroyed. Moral of the story: God is merciful, even when we don't deserve it. But partial faith leads to partial victory. Jehoash could have had total success, but he didn't go all in. When God gives you an opportunity, don't hold back. Trust him fully, and he'll give you complete victory. 2 Kings 14. After Joash was assassinated, his son Amaziah became king of Judah at 25 years old. He followed God to an extent. He did what was right in the Lord's eyes, but not like David. He still allowed idol worship in Judah. Amaziah's first move, his first big decision, handling the men who killed his father. He had them executed, but he obeyed the law of Moses and didn't kill their children, since God commanded that people should only be punished for their own sins, not their families. Victory and arrogance. Amaziah gathered his army and went to war against Edom. He defeated 10,000 Edomites and even captured their city, Selah, Petra, renaming it Joktheel. Feeling himself after the win, he sent a message to King Jehoash of Israel, saying, "Come face me." Basically, let's see who's really running things. Jehoash responded with a parable. A thistle in Lebanon sent a message to a cedar tree, saying, "Give your daughter to my son." But then a wild beast came along and trampled the thistle. Translation: Stay in your lane, little man. You got one victory and now you think you're unstoppable? Don't start a fight you can't finish. Amaziah didn't listen. They went to war, and Israel crushed Judah. Jehoash broke down part of Jerusalem's wall, looted the temple of God and the royal palace, and took hostages before heading back to Samaria. Amaziah's downfall. After this embarrassing defeat, the people of Judah turned on Amaziah. A conspiracy formed against him, and he fled to Lachish, but they hunted him down and killed him there. His body was brought back and buried in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in Israel, after Jehoash died, his son Jeroboam II became king. Even though he did evil in God's sight, he was a strong ruler, expanding Israel's borders and restoring lost territories, just like the prophet Jonah had prophesied. Despite Israel's sins, God showed mercy because he saw how much they were struggling. He didn't allow them to be completely wiped out. After ruling 41 years, Jeroboam II died, and his son Zechariah became king. Moral of the story: just because you win a battle doesn't mean you're ready for a war. Pride will have you fighting battles God never told you to fight. Amaziah won against Edom, but got humbled when he messed with Israel. And yet, even when his people made mistakes, God remained merciful. He sees our struggles and still gives us chances to turn back to him. 2 Kings 15. Azariah, Uzziah, the leper king. In Judah, Azariah, also called Uzziah, became king at just 16 years old and ruled for 52 years. He did what was right in God's eyes, but like his predecessors, he didn't remove the high places, so people kept offering sacrifices outside of God's temple. Because of his unfaithfulness later in life, God struck him with leprosy, and he had to live in isolation while his son Jotham handled the kingdom's affairs. Israel's chaos, kings dropping like flies. Meanwhile, Israel was a mess. Kings were rising and falling like dominoes. 1. Zechariah, son of Jeroboam II, ruled for 6 months before Shallum assassinated him, fulfilling God's promise that Jehu's dynasty would last 4 generations. 2. Shallum only lasted 1 month before Menahem killed him and took the throne. 3rd Menahem ruled for 10 years, but he was brutal. He attacked cities and even ripped open pregnant women. When King Pul of Assyria invaded, Menahem paid him off with silver, taxing the wealthy to save himself. Assyria backed off, but this was the beginning of Israel's downfall. 4th Pekahiah, Menahem's son, ruled for 2 years before his officer Pekah assassinated him in the palace. 5th Pekah ruled for 20 years, but during his reign, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria came through and started taking Israel's land, conquering Galilee and Naphtali and exiling people. Eventually, Hoshea assassinated Pekah and took his place. Back in Judah, Jotham takes over. After Azariah, Uzziah, died, his son Jotham became king. He ruled 16 years, followed God's ways, and even built the upper gate of the temple. But just like before, the high places stayed, and people continued worshiping outside of God's temple. During Jotham's reign, God allowed Aram and Israel to start causing problems for Judah, setting the stage for bigger conflicts ahead. Morale of the story: when a nation turns from God, corruption spreads, leaders fall, and enemies take over. Judah was holding on because of God's promise to David, but Israel, their constant rebellion led to total instability. Whether a king ruled 6 months or 52 years, obedience determined their legacy, not their time on the throne. If you want lasting success, stay aligned with God. 2 Kings 16. Ahaz, the wicked king of Judah. In Judah, Ahaz became king, and he was one of the worst yet. Unlike his father and grandfather, who at least tried to follow God, Ahaz went all in on evil. He worshipped idols, sacrificed his own son in fire, and followed the detestable practices of the surrounding nations. Despite his rebellion, God still tried to get his attention. King Rezin of Aram and King Pekah of Israel attacked Judah, causing major problems. They even took territory and exiled people, shaking up the kingdom. Ahaz's desperate move, calling on Assyria. Instead of turning to God for help, Ahaz sent a message to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, "I'm your servant. Come save me." To make it worse, he emptied out the Lord's temple and his own palace, sending silver and gold to Assyria as a bribe. Assyria took the deal. They attacked Damascus, captured it, and killed King Rezin. Ahaz went up to meet Tiglath-Pileser in Damascus, and while he was there, he saw an altar that impressed him. Instead of seeking God, he copied the pagan altar and sent the design back to Urijah the priest, telling him to build the exact same one in the temple of God. Disrespecting God's temple. When Ahaz got back to Jerusalem, he removed the bronze altar from its place and put the pagan altar in its spot. Then he had the nerve to use it for sacrifices, totally disrespecting God. But he didn't stop there. He tore apart sacred temple furnishings to impress the king of Assyria. Shut down parts of the temple, blocking access to God's house. Built more altars to false gods all over Jerusalem. Ahaz was so deep in idol worship that he completely abandoned God. When he died, his son Hezekiah became king. Moral of the story: When you put your trust in man instead of God, it will always cost you. Ahaz thought Assyria was his savior, but they were just using him. Instead of turning to God, he doubled down on his rebellion, and it led to Judah's downfall. Compromising your faith for power or approval will always lead to destruction. 2 Kings 17. So Israel had been wilding for a minute, straight up ignoring God, doing their own thing and worshiping idols like he hadn't been the one holding them down. They had kings that didn't care about the covenant, and the people just followed right along. They mixed in with other nations, picked up their ways, and started serving fake gods, even though God had warned them over and over through his prophets. But they weren't trying to hear it. God had been patient, but enough was enough. He let the Assyrians come through and take over, exiling Israel from their own land. The people got scattered, and just like that, everything God had given them was gone because they chose to turn their backs on him. The Assyrians even brought in other people to live in Israel's land, and those folks didn't know God either, so lions started attacking them. That's when they realized they needed to learn how to respect the land's true God. They brought in a priest to teach them, but instead of fully surrendering, they just added God to their list of gods instead of giving him their whole heart. Moral of the story: you can't play both sides with God. You either rock with him fully, or you set yourself up to lose everything. Israel thought they could mix God's truth with the world's ways, but it cost them their home, their security, and their future. Half-hearted obedience is still disobedience. 2 Kings 18. Hezekiah became king of Judah, and for once they had a real one on the throne. He wasn't like the kings before him. He actually did right by God. He tore down all the idols, smashed the altars, and even destroyed that bronze snake Moses had made because people had started worshiping it instead of God. Hezekiah was different. He trusted God fully, and because of that, God had his back in everything he did. During his reign, the king of Assyria came through and started taking over cities. Eventually, he pulled up to Jerusalem, talking reckless, trying to shake Judah's faith. He sent his men to tell the people, "Y'all might as well give up now. Don't let Hezekiah fool you into thinking your God can save you. Look at all these other nations we crushed. Their gods ain't do nothing for them." The Assyrians were out there trying to break Judah's spirit, making them doubt that God was really with them. But Hezekiah wasn't about to let fear run the show. He didn't fold, didn't negotiate. He went straight to God with it. Moral of the story: when pressure hits, don't let the enemy shake your faith. The world will try to make you doubt God's power, but when you stay locked in with him, you don't have to fear anything. Trust God like Hezekiah did, and watch him move on your behalf. 2 Kings 19. When Hezekiah heard all that trash the Assyrians were talking, he didn't panic. He went straight to God. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, a sign of humility, and hit up the prophet Isaiah, asking him to pray. Isaiah let him know that God had already peeped the situation and that he was about to handle it. Meanwhile, the king of Assyria sent another message, doubling down on the threats. He basically said, "Look, don't let your God deceive you. None of the other nations' gods could stop us, so what makes you think yours will?" Instead of responding to the threats, Hezekiah took that letter, went to the temple, laid it out before God, and prayed. He was like, "Lord, you see this. They're not just coming for us. They're coming for you. Show them who you are." God answered through Isaiah, letting Hezekiah know that Assyria was playing with fire. God had been letting them win battles, but now they were about to learn who was really in control. That very night, an angel of the Lord wiped out 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. By morning, their whole army was in shambles. The king of Assyria ran back home humiliated, and while he was worshiping in his own temple, his own sons took him out. Moral of the story: when the enemy comes at you, don't argue. Take it to God. He sees it all and he fights battles way better than you ever could. Stay faithful, stay humble, and watch how he shuts down every threat against you. 2 Kings 20. Hezekiah got real sick, and Isaiah came through with some bad news. Get your house in order. You're about to die. But Hezekiah wasn't ready to go. He turned to the wall, prayed hard, and reminded God how he had been walking right and serving him with his whole heart. Before Isaiah even left the palace, God told him to go back and deliver a new message. I heard your prayer. I saw your tears. I'm adding 15 more years to your life. On top of that, God promised to protect Jerusalem from their enemies. As a sign, he even made the sun move backward on the sundial. Later, some dudes from Babylon pulled up, acting like they just wanted to check on Hezekiah. He, not realizing they had ulterior motives, showed them everything: his treasures, weapons, and all his kingdom's riches. After they left, Isaiah was like, "Who were those guys and what did you show them?" Hezekiah told him, and Isaiah hit him with the hard truth. Because of this, one day Babylon is going to come through and take everything, including your descendants. Hezekiah accepted it, but since it wouldn't happen in his lifetime, he figured at least things would stay peaceful while he was around. Moral of the story: God hears your prayers and sees your struggles. He's got the power to turn things around. But be careful who you let in your circle. Not everyone clapping for you has good intentions. Stay discerning and don't get too comfortable just because things are good in the moment. Think about the bigger picture. 2 Kings 21. After Hezekiah, his son Manasseh took over, and let's just say he was nothing like his father. He went full rebel mode against God, bringing back all the idol worship his dad tore down. He built altars for fake gods, even in God's own temple, practiced witchcraft, sacrificed his own son, and led the whole nation into straight-up wickedness. Manasseh wasn't just wild. He was the worst king Judah had ever seen. God sent prophets to warn the people, but nobody wanted to listen. So God said, "Since y'all refuse to turn back, I'm about to bring disaster on Judah, the same way I did Israel. Y'all are out here acting like you don't know me, so I'm about to let your enemies come through and clean house." And that's exactly what happened. Judah's future was sealed because of Manasseh's evil leadership. Then came his son Ammon, who was just as bad but didn't last long. His own people turned on him and took him out. Moral of the story: leadership matters. When you stray too far from God, it doesn't just affect you. It can bring down a whole generation. Bad decisions have consequences, and when you push God away for too long, you might not like what comes next. 2 Kings 22. Then came Josiah, and finally Judah had a king who actually cared about doing right. He became king at just 8 years old, and as he grew, he walked in God's ways like his ancestor David. No idols, no foolishness. Years later, Josiah told his crew to fix up the temple, and while they were working, the high priest found the book of the law. Basically, God's instructions that had been ignored for generations. When they read it to Josiah, he realized just how far off Judah had been. He tore his clothes in grief, knowing that God's wrath was coming because of how the nation had been living. Josiah sent his people to ask a prophetess named Huldah what was about to go down. She confirmed that God was, in fact, about to bring destruction to Judah because of all the sins their past kings had stacked up. But since Josiah's heart was humble and he truly repented, God promised he wouldn't let it happen in Josiah's lifetime. Moral of the story: when you know better, do better. Josiah didn't make excuses for Judah's past. He owned up to it and took action. God honors a humble heart that truly wants to change. Just because destruction is coming doesn't mean you have to go down with it. Turn back to God while you still can. 2 Kings 23. Josiah wasn't playing. After hearing God's word, he called everybody, the elders, the priests, the people. and had them listen to the book of the law. Right then and there, he made a covenant to follow God fully, and he expected everyone else to do the same. Then he got to work. He went on a full cleanse of the land, wiping out every trace of idol worship. He tore down the altars, smashed the idols, and burned the bones of false priests to desecrate their shrines. He even went to Bethel and destroyed the high places that had been there since Jeroboam's rebellion. Josiah left no room for compromise. He also reinstated the Passover, something that hadn't been properly celebrated in generations. This was a big deal. Judah was finally remembering who they were supposed to be. But despite Josiah's faithfulness, God's judgment on Judah was still set. The sins of Manasseh had stacked up too high, and destruction was inevitable. Sadly, Josiah later got killed in battle when he went up against Egypt, and after him, Judah's kings went right back to their wicked ways. One by one, they fell deeper into sin until Babylon eventually came through and took over. Moral of the story: Josiah showed that real change starts with action, not just words. He cleaned house and led by example, proving that following God requires full commitment. But sometimes, past sins have consequences that can't be undone. The best way to avoid destruction is to never turn away from God in the first place. 2 Kings 24. By this point, Judah was on a downward spiral, and nothing was stopping the judgment that had been coming for them. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon rolled up and made Judah his territory. At first, King Jehoiakim served him, but after a while he tried to rebel. Bad move. God had already decided to let Judah fall because of all the wickedness from Manasseh's reign. So he let Babylon, along with some other nations, come through and attack. Jehoiakim ended up dying, and his son Jehoiachin took over. But he wasn't any better. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't about to play games with Judah's rebellion. He came back, raided the temple, took all the treasures, and exiled the best of Judah, its leaders, warriors, and skilled workers, back to Babylon. He only left behind the poorest people. Then he put Zedekiah, Jehoiachin's uncle, on the throne as a puppet king. But even Zedekiah wouldn't listen to God, and he kept leading Judah further into destruction. Moral of the story: when you keep ignoring God's warnings, eventually, judgment comes. Judah's downfall wasn't random. It was the result of years of rebellion. They had plenty of chances to repent, but they didn't take them. Don't wait until it's too late to get right with God. Choices have consequences. 2 Kings 25. This was it, the final chapter of Judah's downfall. King Zedekiah thought he could shake off Babylon's control, so he rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't having it. He brought his army, surrounded Jerusalem, and put the whole city on lockdown for 2 years. No food was coming in. People were starving, and it got so bad that when the walls were finally broken through, the soldiers ran for their lives. But Babylon caught up with Zedekiah, captured him, and made an example out of him. They killed his sons right in front of him, then took his sight so that would be the last thing he ever saw. After that, Babylon burned Jerusalem to the ground, the temple, the palace, every important building. They tore down the city walls, took anything valuable left in the temple, and carried almost everyone into exile. Only a few poor folks were left behind to work the land. Nebuchadnezzar put Gedaliah in charge of the people who remained, but he got assassinated, and after that, the few left in Judah panicked and ran off to Egypt. Just like that, the kingdom of Judah was no more, but even in exile, there was a small sign of hope. Years later, the king of Babylon released Jehoiachin, the former king of Judah, from prison and gave him a place at the king's table. It was a reminder that, despite everything, God wasn't finished with his people yet. Moral of the story: if you keep ignoring God, eventually everything you relied on will crumble. Judah thought they could do their own thing and still be safe, but without God, they lost everything. But even in judgment, God leaves a door open for redemption. No matter how bad things get, his promises never die.